Hey everyone, my name is Ryan and I'm back with another video. Today's video will be my mostly spoiler-free review of The Miseducation of Cameron Post by Emily M. Danforth. Before I begin, this book definitely has some trigger warnings about homophobia, especially homophobia centered around Christianity, as well as conversion therapy, death of a family member, and grief, and I think mentions of cancer as well. These are all things that are very present in this book, so if you have issues with any of those or are sensitive to any of those topics, I would recommend either staying away from this book or just being a little bit wary if you do choose to go into this. That being said, let's get into it. So going into this, I was very familiar about the story. I'd heard a lot about it. I think this is definitely one of the staples of LGBT fiction, especially from like the early 2010s. I feel like this is definitely a book that a lot of people know about or at least have heard of, even if they haven't read it. But even knowing that, I still hadn't read it. So I was really looking forward going into it, and I'm very happy to say that I really enjoyed it. The Miseducation of Cameron Post follows a girl named Cameron Post in her childhood years, following her all the way up to her teenage years, as she is realizing that she's a lesbian and discovering her sexuality and living in a small town in the late 80s and early 90s and having to navigate the attitude that those people have towards homosexuality. In addition to that, Cameron's parents also died when she was very young, and the book also goes very deep into her grief and how that affects her as she grows up as well. I freaking loved this book. I cannot tell you how much I loved this book. I was a little skeptical at first just because I feel like books written around this time period from like the early 2000s, early 2010s, tend to not hold up as well or don't stand out as hard as they did back when they were published. So I honestly had some pretty low expectations going into this, and I was absolutely blown away. I completely fell in love with Cameron as our main character. She's kind of a little bit reckless at times. She kind of has a like masculine side to her. She's got a little bit of an attitude, but I thought that she was so thoughtful, and the way that she thinks is just so interesting, and I couldn't get enough of her. I also loved that we really got to see her grow up. This book does start when she's a little kid. I think it starts when she's like 9 or 10, and by the end of it, I think she's about 16. So we do grow up with her a bit as the story progresses, and I just loved seeing her develop, and I loved seeing the way that things happen in her life early on affect her later on in life as well. We do get a multitude of different characters here, from a childhood best friend that she was in love with as a child, to her grandma that she has a really complex but strong relationship with, and an aunt that moves in after her parents' death that she has a very strained relationship with. And there's some friends along the way that she finds solace in, and I loved seeing the different relationships that she has with people, and they were all so different from each other, and every character impacted her in a different way. And I thought that that was really well done, because no character, even though there were kind of a lot of characters, there weren't any that just felt like a waste of a character, and every character felt like they were adding something to the story, even if they weren't in it for very long. Another thing I loved about this book is the grief element. We all know I love grief in stories and seeing how characters deal with their grief. And the thing that I thought was interesting is that Cameron's parents have a very strong presence in her life, and she does a lot of things to deal with the death of them. But in the narrative, it's not necessarily said outright, and she's not necessarily thinking about them all the time. I feel like Cameron is a character who definitely bottles up her emotions and has learned not to display them, and I thought it was really interesting to see the way in which her grief is sort of subconsciously handled in the narrative. Next, I want to talk about the setting. This book takes place in a very small town in Montana, and I absolutely loved the way that the setting was handled. The way the author writes about the setting is so vivid, not even just in the descriptions and the imagery, because it is, but also just the feeling. A lot of times in contemporary novels, we sort of get this thing where the setting doesn't really matter to the story, which is fine, but in some stories it kind of means that the story could really be taking place anywhere, you know? But this is not the case with this book. The setting was a very important factor in the story, and I cannot imagine this book taking place anywhere else. This definitely felt like the setting was very important. And I was looking at the about the author at the very end of the book, and I noticed that the author was raised in the same town that the book takes place. So I'm wondering if she was drawing on her own experience growing up in that town, which I actually think is really interesting. The next thing I want to talk about is just how normal and mundane this book really is. This is a very slowly paced book. You spend the entire time in Cameron's head as she's navigating life, and even though this isn't necessarily a plot where there's a lot of action or where there's a lot of events right after the other or a lot of things taking place, I still got so much out of it, and I really grew close to a lot of the characters. Because it was so slow, we really spent a lot of time in Cameron's head, and because it's so slowly paced, I felt like I was really spending a lot of time with her as she was growing up, and I could definitely understand why the slow pace would turn a lot of people off, but I personally really enjoyed it. The writing in this book is so just it's everything to me. It was so detailed, but not in the way that seemed pretentious or flowery or just overdone in any way. Things were just described in the way that I just felt like Cameron would naturally describe them. And Cameron's attitude and personality also carries into the prose as well, which I thought was a really interesting element of the narration. Going back to the characters, I loved the way in which this book explored different types of relationships and how they have an impact on Cameron as a character. Not only do we have the death of Cameron's parents affecting her, but we also see her relationship with her grandmother and her relationship with a conservative aunt that moves in after her parents' death. And we get several different friend groups that shape her as she gets older and as the story goes on, and I thought that they were all just so interesting. Next, I just want to briefly talk about on how this book handles faith and the conversion therapy element. I thought that it was interesting the way that this was handled because it's not the entirety of the story. I wouldn't go into this book thinking that, oh, it's a conversion therapy story. This is Cameron Post's story, and conversion therapy is an element of her life that she went through. And by the time she got there, because I was so attached to her and I felt so strongly for her as a character, it was so gut-wrenching to see her go through that. One of the things that really stuck out to me and really got me was that when they are sending her there, she reads the brochure for the camp or school that she's going to be going to, and they actually have the brochure on page in the book, so it's like you're reading a real brochure. And it just got me and made me so emotional because it just made me think that, you know, that brochure is not made just for the book. There are real conversion therapy places that actually do this in the real world, and it really did get to me. I think overall the thing that I really loved the most about this book is that it's not a book where, you know, something specific happens and, you know, there's a really sad climax and then you're crying all the way to the end. The sadness in this book is very thorough and very slow, and it's rolling throughout the book. And it's not something that's very necessarily specific, but it's just basically the entire vibe of this book is sad, and it just got to me. It really did. This whole book just really gives off sadness and loneliness and grief and not really knowing what your place is. and that comes from her discovering her sexuality, and that comes from the conversion therapy, and that comes from growing up in a small town, and it all just kind of adds up to this just being a very sad and emotional book. With all of that in mind, this book is the perfect formula of everything that I love in a hard-hitting contemporary. It has queer themes, it's slice of life, it's very slow and character-driven, it's very emotional, and it's a coming-of-age story with a very distinct setting and very distinct characters. And with all of that combined, I absolutely adored this book, and I gave it 5 stars. So yeah, honestly, there's a lot more that I could say on this book. I could talk about this book forever. I absolutely loved it, but if you've read it, let me know what you think down in the comments, and I'd love to chat about this book with you. But yeah, that is all that I have for you today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to be kind.